wet, cold, miserable Friday night on Teesside that Norwich City will be keen to forget very, very quickly. We've made the long trip back down the A1 on Saturday morning / afternoon, and we thought it was finally time to pull ourselves around the table to dissect and discuss what was a humiliating night for Norwich City, a 5-1 defeat away to Middlesbrough that has left their playoff aspirations hanging by a thread, but probably beyond that left a lot more ill will and negative feeling around what they're doing, where they are, and certainly what this season has become. I'm Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy, Davitt and Seaman. This is this week's edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast in association with Future Radio. I'm going to set the scene for you. We're sat in a lovely, I think I can say Asda, can't I? Yeah, I can say Asda. We're not the BBC. We're sat in Asda.
If there's a sponsorship deal to be done with any supermarket, we're not precious.
No, we're not.
We're open to offers.
Yeah, we're sat in an Asda in Norwich. I'm drinking a tea. What have you got there, Pat?
Yeah, I've got a tea. Yeah,
good.
I went hot chocolate. I'm quite bored of hot chocolate by now, but I don't really, I don't fancy paying like £2.50 for a tea or whatever when you.
It's only £1.25.
Okay, well that's a little bit better, but I reckon I can make it for 13p at home. So
we've got sort of different colours of tea, Pad. I'd say mine's significantly darker than yours.
I was looking at that colour and that's not tea in my house.
I didn't know it was tea, to be honest.
To be honest,
more hot chocolate. That,
to be honest, it does look a bit more like coffee, to be honest. But I could drink black tea. I don't, because it's terrible for your teeth.
It's wrong.
And it's also wrong.
Wrong on every level.
But sometimes you'll get. So McDonald's is a good example. I've gone to McDonald's and got a tea before, and they don't automatically put milk in. And I've just drank it and not noticed. So,
not noticed?
No.
That's unreal.
So I quite like a strong tea. Yours is definitely a lot milkier than mine.
On the other end of the spectrum when it comes to tea, additional elements.
Yeah.
No sugar though. Managed to wean myself off that in recent years. Counteracted by the trash that we eat on these trips to and from. So yeah, it's not really a huge saving to my metabolism by cutting out tea, coffee, and my sugar in my tea. But there you go. Move on.
Yeah, should we start away from the football? Let's start with the activities around the weekend. It's been quite eventful. It was we left actually not far from where we're sat now. We left at about midday. What time was it?
About 12:35.
Yeah, about 12:35 on Friday, and didn't pull into the Riverside. And that was. Did we stop? We didn't stop, did we? Without a stop, pulled in. Only a brief petrol stop, but it was about 6:10, wasn't it? So. It gives you a sense of the magnitude of the trip. The A1 just very slow moving, lots of kind of traffic issues without there being anything specific really kind of holding you up. So that's a brief window. Obviously, the vast majority of the 600 plus Norwich City fans would have endured a slightly similar journey. Sam, I'm going to let you pick up the story from here. We get about an hour and a half away from the Riverside Stadium. Just talk to us about the events that happened.
Well, I was the last to find out what was happening with my accreditation on the day, but yeah, basically the way it works is obviously when you sort of apply to go to a game as a news organisation, you apply for the car parking usually, so that you've got a spot by the ground, and also as journalists we all have to apply individually to get into the press areas, and usually there's not any problem whatsoever, so we don't tend to, I don't think, check those things especially thoroughly, but along with some logistical reasons that probably are a bit too boring to get into. As you say, Pad checked for the car parking about an hour and a half away from the Riverside, and then Paddy was in the front of the car, me and you were in the back of it, and he showed you the thing, and I thought Paddy said like, "Oh, bad news, Connor," and I thought, "Oh, we've not got a parking space," until it's revealed I've got the same news, and I'm thinking, I already know about the car parking space. You don't need to inform me, Pad. Except it says that I've not got into the ground. I've not been allowed into the press areas. And I've then worked out that me and you are both probably set for a trip straight to the hotel to sit in one of our rooms and cover the game from an hour away or whatever. But thankfully we turned up. We gave it the old I mean, you did more, to be fair. I was a bit like, you were like my big brother, and I was sort of
sometimes in life you have to kind of wing your way in and talk your way in. I would say that I did do drama in education at school, so I managed to kind of get the best puppy dog eyes on, and we've come a long way from Norwich, and luckily I say luckily, maybe not in the end, but they did let us in, Pad.
Yeah, shout out to Borough's head of comms, Paul Clues, who was...
Hughes, I think it is.
Clues, is it?
Hughes.
Paul, his name's Paul anyway. Shout out, who was called to the reception area where I led the delegation from that point, and he was, I think, I got the sense maybe at the start of the conversation he was probably, I think he re-established
I would say us saying that we came all the way from Norwich.
You've stolen me. That was me. I was going to say that was the tipping point when he realised that these four idiots had actually got in a car and not checked that they all had accreditation until an hour and a half from our destination. I mean, he basically made it clear that their policy as a club is 2 per organisation. So obviously Adam and myself were already in. And 4 into 2 doesn't really go, does it? I know your maths isn't great, Connor, but it does go, but not in the sense of you, 4 people needing to get in when there's only 2 been allowed to go in. So in the end, it all came out in the wash. But that's the first time we've experienced that this season. It was didn't add to what was already quite a depressing car journey. Put it that way, given the incessant rain, traffic. Hour and a half longer than it should have taken, and to then discover that did contribute. Well, I mean, as events then transpired on the pitch, it probably set the tone for the evening, didn't it, really? And I'm sure you two would have liked to have been back at our very nice establishment with a roaring fire and I don't know, with your slippers on and a hot chocolate watching it on the telly, because you might have been spared the worst excesses of it. But no, it was it was one of the more memorable journeys we've had. But thankfully, after the game at least, it got a bit better in terms of where we were staying, which was very nice. We won't give that a shout out. But no, that was not an experience we need to repeat, and we'll probably have to put some processes in place to ensure that before we depart Norwich in future, we actually know that we're in the ground. But there you go. So you're always learning in this job. But as I say, shout out to Paul, head of comms at Borough, surname to be decided.
Yes, absolutely. And I think actually come about 45 minutes, Sam, we were probably wishing that we weren't in the ground, because it was not a good night for Norwich City. I think we've put off talking about the football for long enough. I mean, and we spoke about this last week really on the podcast, and we were speaking about Rotherham and how you could maybe view that as in David Wagner's tone as being you could kind of flip it and you could say, well, 4 points over the Easter weekend. You could make an argument that was relatively productive, even if that Monday we all felt was a little bit of a wasted opportunity. You stretch that over the week now, park the result for a minute and the nature of the performance, because we'll come to that, but purely the opportunity that they had, where if they wouldn't have lost this game, if they'd have drawn or won, they'd have gone up to 5th in the table. It all feels radically different, and instead they failed to do that. It's the second missed opportunity in a week, and I think it feels like we're going to talk about or talk a lot about mentality and kind of what's between the ears. That kind of feels quite fitting, I guess, of where this Norwich City group are.
Yeah, and I think it's another one of those moments where, and it feels like there's been a few this season, I think because the league is so poor, there's so many inconsistent teams, and Norwich themselves have been so inconsistent, it's a bit of a theme actually to look at the table and think actually things aren't that bad, but you apply the context of obviously not only the result but the way that they played, and I think anyone watching that game will be well aware that it was a completely fair result. It was no sort of misinformation as to how things played out. I think it was exactly how you would have expected from the 2 performances from the teams. And despite the fact that Norwich, as the Saturday 3 o'clock games sort of kick off now, are still right in the mix, probably tells you what you need to know about the Championship, but also highlights what a missed opportunity it's been this whole season for Norwich. And we can highlight Rotherham and we can highlight Middlesbrough and other games, but there are numerous games really at various points across this season. But it feels like actually Norwich have come down into one of the worst championships in my view of modern times, and the whole thing is a missed opportunity because they came down and the financial processes that they put in place, the loans they took out and the money they spent in the transfer market really put a lot of pressure on them to be promoted in a season when it's probably would have been easier than the last two, and yet they've ended up, I mean, they won't be close to automatic promotion, and the playoff hopes feel miles and miles away despite the proximity points wise. And yeah, I've said it numerous times this season, David Wagner and Dean Smith can apply the context of, we're not too far away from the playoffs as much as they like. What really needs to be considered, and I know this isn't Wagner's fault, I think without pointing too many fingers, I'm sure Norwich fans know where they think that blame lies, but decisions were made in the summer about a club that should be promoted from the Championship, in my view, every time they're there, let alone when other teams are faltering on a very consistent basis and struggling for the form that Norwich have struggled for all season. So yeah, I've broadened it out quite far there, but I just felt that yesterday was such an indication of where Norwich have been this whole season, and I think Norwich fans were just fed up afterwards, and they're totally fair too. And I've seen a lot of people on social media talking about how people are blaming Stuart Webber for 15 minutes of madness or whatever, or how people are looking higher than the coaches and the players for individual errors, and I think that's taking it out of context, and that's ignoring actually what people are saying. And what people are saying is that this team is not good enough, and all the resources were there to make it a team plenty good enough to make the playoffs, and probably should have been good enough to get in the automatic. So where Norwich find themselves, if not in terms of points, in terms of performances, is really quite bleak for Norwich fans, I think.
That context that Sam spoke about there, that David Wagner has applied, I think we heard it from Dean Smith as well when he was in charge, although Norwich were probably more in the top six when he was in charge compared to where they have been. But at what point do we say they haven't been in the top six since December, they've won 1 in 7 games, that this is just where they are in the table? Because they've proven, they've had 2 opportunities now to break into that top 6, 4 games left. It's now not going to be in their control after today if certain results go in the way that we probably anticipate that they will. At what point do we just say that maybe sums up this Norwich group, that they were close but not close enough to what they're trying to achieve this season?
Well, I mean, I think some would take issue with they're close to what the objective is, because the objective was automatic promotion, and they're nowhere near that. Let's get the caveat of the injury situation parked and out of the way, and then we can move on. Yes, of course, nobody disputes, and I thought it was graphically illustrated in terms of the lack of leadership on Friday night, particularly when the wheels started to come off, and to quote Wagner, they lost their heads in that sort of spell just before half-time. That no Hanley, no Gibson, no McLean, just purely as leaders and experienced players on the pitch, just to steady what was a very turbulent period. You cannot underestimate.
But they hadn't done that when those players were in the side in certain games.
Well, yeah, in certain games, yeah. But I think that ultimately, if David Wagner had all his players available, certainly 2 of those 3 would start. I think that's indisputable. You could obviously debate whether on Daly and Gibson they would flip-flop, but the other 2 would start. So in terms of is without key elements over this period now, and that's a discussion because only it's a factor outside of his control. So you can't do anything about injuries. You could debate that other clubs have probably got similar injuries, and that may be the case, but take that off the table now, and everything else for me is in his control, is in those players' control. More broadly, to take Sam's point, was in the control of Stuart Webber and the people close around him and the executive committee before his ball was kicked. And to be here now at this stage, games in progress as we record this, but potentially they could be as low as 10th by the Saturday evening, off the back of heavy defeat on Friday night. 1 win in 7 at this stage of the season, that's just unacceptable, injuries or no injuries. So I think if you've got a ledger from Cardiff onwards, and it's all the right decisions on and off the pitch that football club have taken versus all the poor ones, then we know where the imbalance lies, and ultimately people should be accountable for that. And it doesn't just rest with one individual at the apex. Every level of this club, they need to internally look at themselves, maybe when the dust settles and definitively we know it's Championship football again, and question even on a micro level, what am I responsible for at this football club? Did I carry out what I needed to do? Did I hit my targets? Did I achieve what I needed to do? And then you stitch all those constituent parts together, and you're left with a football club who, measured and benchmarked by their own stated aim of automatic promotion for the third consecutive time at this level, with the financial commitment they made to make that happen this time round, if, as it would seem likely now, it's not going to reach those goals or that goal, that mission statement, that's failure. However you want to dice it, however many mitigations you want to put on the table in terms of injuries, which are there, agreed. But for me, I think anybody externally or internally looking at this football club right at the moment would say it's not right, it's not working, and that's not a matter of opinion. The facts are there. If Norwich finish, we'll say anywhere in a spread between 7th and 10th, 7th and 11th, that's failure. That clearly, over a 46-game cycle, 9 months and more, if you add in all the planning that went in subsequently following relegation from the Premier League, that huge body of work, and nobody for a moment is suggesting it's easy and that Norwich were just going to turn up at all these outposts and 9 months later they were back in the Premier League. Of course, anybody who's watched the last 2 times at this level, it is hard, even though they've come out the right side of it. There were moments of adversity, there were periods where they had to deal with negative elements around a campaign, but they found a way through on both those occasions. This time they've just got lost in the forest. They don't seem to know what they are, what they're trying to be, how they go about achieving it. And that isn't just purely about Wagner now, following on from Smith and a group of players. I think it's the club more broadly. That's why it feels, it isn't just tinkering this summer in terms of we'll take that player away, or this player will go anyway, or we need to sell this player from the financial point of view, and then we'll bring in 1 or 2 others to fill the holes, and away we go. I think it's far more fundamental than that, and that's the challenge, and it's a huge challenge. But we can discuss that as and when as we get to the summer. But I think it just boils down to me that it's failure. Any way you slice this is failure for this club, this group of players, this head coach. Less so because he's not had a huge amount of time, and he's certainly not really, the one window he had, they brought in a lad on loan from Arsenal and they recalled Christos Solis, from a loan spell in Holland. So I'm not saying you can exclude Wagner from criticism, because ultimately he's had enough games now that we all feel we should be seeing something better and something more akin to the good parts of his reign, the Millwall game, the Coventry game, the Preston game, 1 or 2 others along the way. So of course he has questions to answer, but obviously he has now inherited what was put in place last summer, long before he arrived in the building, and that's ultimately where the book stops. So while there's still hope, they'll continue to fight, but the door now is pretty much closed. I think there's a shaft of light, and that might swiftly be closed post this afternoon's games, and certainly if they go to QPR and don't get a win on Wednesday coming. So maybe then we can definitively basically dissect a failure of a season. But even if they scrambled into the top 6 now, does anybody really think this group are good enough to come through that? Because the reality is they probably would meet a Borough somewhere in that playoff conundrum. They probably would meet a Luton. Are they good enough to beat those type of teams, even if they were able miraculously to get a McLean or get a Gibson back? I don't think they are. So it doesn't rest on the shoulders of one individual, but as a club, from top to bottom, it's not good at the minute, and it feels tired, as I tweeted I think last night after the game. Tired, it's jaded, it feels like an end of an era, and this summer will only have to be the start of that, because we all saw how long it took Webber in 17 with Farquhar alongside him to engineer what came to pass in 18-19. It took multiple transfer windows, it took a full season of mediocre Championship football where they finished below Ipswich. And dare one say, the way Ipswich are going, they have to seal the deal in League One. But if you, as you probably do expect them to come back up, then that might be where we are next season as well, them finishing below Ipswich in the Championship. Because I think this is now going to take far more than one summer of medicine. It's the patient's not looking too healthy at the minute. So But we'll park that for now. Ultimately, we're discussing what happened on Friday at Middlesbrough off the back of what hasn't happened in the last few weeks, few months. And any way you look at it, whatever perspective you're coming from, whether you're pro a Webber, whether you're anti-Webber, whether you're pro these players, pro the ownership or anti it, what isn't in dispute is right now, as we record here, they are a million miles away from what we were sold they were going to be, which was an automatic promotion challenging group of players. That hasn't happened, so ultimately people have to be held accountable for that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the most comparable thing to this situation, and not exactly comparable, but is the last time we were here, which was when Alex Neil was in charge. He got dismissed in that March, didn't they? I think they finished 8th in the end. And again, it was kind of that thing of maybe always being close to the playoffs without ever really looking like they were going to get into it. So again, there are parallels there. But that was deemed enough of a failure for the club to completely split the way they operate, to have a massive churn of players, decide to embark on a new project. So I'm not saying that is the case, but are we in a similar position to that? I mean, it's only the people inside who can answer that. Are we that far away from it? Also, is another point. And I think back when you were talking there, I think it was Ralph Rangnick when he was at Man United last summer spoke about surgery and open heart surgery, didn't it? And I think so it's kind of proven, and obviously on a very different level to what Norwich are operating in. But it is. And I mentioned this on a podcast a few weeks ago. Whenever anyone has come out to talk about the plan or what the club is or whatever, it's always been, oh yeah, we want to get to the Premier League. Okay, but how are you going to get there? No, we want to get to the Premier League. That's the aim, and we want to stay there. Brilliant. Well, tell us how you're going to do it. And no one has been able to kind of tell you how you can do it. And I think you see this with relegated clubs a lot. It's why Stoke have been trapped down at this level for a while. It's why West Brom have been the same, because they just kind of lose focus and lose their identity of what they are and what they're trying to be, because it's almost like a tunnel vision view on getting to the Premier League. And when you put all your eggs in that basket, it can be so damaging. You spoke about it earlier in terms of the loans, the transfer policy, and to an extent that was why they embarked on this direction, because they didn't want it to be that. They wanted to have a sort of wider, more philosophical outlook on football to an extent, and yet it feels like they've almost conformed back to that, and we find ourselves in this situation again. And I don't really want to talk about the summer, because we're going to have we're definitely going to have plenty of time to speak about that in the weeks ahead. But they've got players who again are on a lot of money that they're going to struggle to shift this summer, because they're on a lot of money, and people are going to have to buy players who have underperformed this season. So it's a really tricky spot that they've got themselves in. And again, you mentioned the mitigation of injuries, and you can accept that, but Sam, that group of players that were on the pitch last night, that's not a group of players that should be getting beat 5-1 in the Championship, irrespective of opponent. Yes, Middlesbrough have attacking quality. They've got some really good players in forward areas. But to lose 5-1, to concede 4 goals in 14 minutes, including stoppage time, which is the shortest period in which they've conceded that many goals since the 7-1 defeat at Colchester in 2009. I mean, it's unacceptable, and it's embarrassing as well for fans. I mean, we've on our walk here, we've had one to sort of tell us it was embarrassing. That's how they feel after that Friday night defeat.
Yeah, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for them, to be honest, because they've turned up, probably travelled like us for about 6 hours to get there, spent their hard-earned money, probably a lot of it as well, just to be there. And it's almost like, after the 8th minute, the Middlesbrough fans were loud and they were chanting and they were highlighting everything that was wrong with Norwich and how poor of a team they were, and that team wasn't giving them anything to respond with, to be honest. I think the most exciting and offensive response they could come up with was the fact that Norwich beat Middlesbrough at Wembley a couple of, what is it now, like 8 years ago. So I did feel for those fans quite a lot. It is embarrassing to associate yourself with a football club that's going out there humiliating themselves, and there's no longer a fear of a club who went into the Championship as favourites. Every week there used to be a...
Sorry, it's interrupted because Paddy's... Tell us why you're fist bumping, Paddy. This might backfire dramatically, by the way.
Well, no, I'm only just doing a recce on who QPR are playing today. It just happens to be Coventry, bizarrely. And,
funny that.
Yeah, and Coventry are now 1-0 up.
Go on, tell us it takes them into the
Guy Keresh, what a player he is. I don't know how many he scored, which is pertinent, given Norwich can't hit a backdoor with as whatever the saying is.
Banjo, isn't it?
Yeah. But that puts Cov into the top 6 as it stands.
And Millwall have just taken the lead at Preston as well.
Bigger.
Which
Bradshaw, another striker who scores
more
goals.
pertinently, if you get the table up, I think we'll take Norwich. It pushes the Millwall 4 points ahead of Norwich, and that with 4 games to go is a big total. You're essentially talking about a 2-game swing there. As Paddy was desperate to mention, Coventry, as it stands, have moved up to 6th. But again, we're recording this. It's 17 minutes past 3, so obviously these aren't final. And Blackburn play later in the day. Sorry, Sam. Go back to what you were saying. If you
That's okay. I think I was just saying about how embarrassing it was for those fans, and it was one of those where. As much as I've been a Norwich fan in the past, I've been in those away ends, and there are certainly a lot of good things about it. It was a time when I was absolutely relieved to be on the other side of the stadium and not to have to try and come up with some sort of encouragement for my team. And I think there were chances of City till I die, but it's difficult to see how they're going to come up with any sort of optimism. And yeah, I think even the most sanguine of Norwich fans at this stage is going to struggle to find optimism going into a playoff race that rapidly looks like it's slipping away from them, especially given this used to be a league not too long ago where Norwich fans could turn up at every ground and feel pretty smug. Even when they were 1-0 down, they could just show opposition fans the league table and highlight quite how much better than their rivals they were. And now they're almost a little bit of a soft touch, and a team that probably anyone in the top 6 faces and says this should be a victory. So yeah, for those 600 travelling fans, I felt enormously, and I hope they haven't got too many tickets for the rest of the season, because it's going to be a struggle for sure. And even though they're coming up against some slightly easier opposition, I'm not sure how they're going to find enough points to insert themselves back into that playoff race with the standard. And that's not what we're talking about in terms of how far away it is. Even as the results and the scores develop and it looks like things are getting further away, what makes it feel most like the playoffs are unachievable was that performance, and Wagner isn't going to get to change much of it given that injury crisis. So best of luck to them trying to get behind their team from now on. But after the amount of commitment and money and time and pride they've poured into a season that's left them feeling shortchanged, you wouldn't really blame them if they start to give up.
Yeah, I've felt tremendously for them. They've been brilliant all season in the face of just wild inconsistency. And you said their match tickets aren't cheap. The travel isn't cheap for those fans who came up from Norfolk. I think we saw a post on social media saying that a lot of the coaches didn't get back till 5 to 3 this morning. A lot of them left. I think they left at 12 or half 12. So that's a long old day, and to be served up that is just inexcusable, really. I mean, Angus Gunn essentially he did offer an apology after the game. Described Norwich City's performance as embarrassing. David Wagner probably went further, described it as horrendous. I think we could probably go further if we wanted to, but this is probably wouldn't be broadcastable if we decided to do that. But this was, in many ways, Pad, Norwich City 2022, 2023, their greatest hits, wasn't it? Start relatively well, have a couple of chances that they completely squander, concede with what was really Borough's first attack of the game, then lose their heads and the performance to drastically basically go off a cliff midway through. A little bit of a head loss in the middle as well, miss a couple of good chances for good measure, concede another one, and then just look pretty desperate.
Well, it brings, and I've seen this point made since on social media since Friday night, but we're going full circle back to, at the time, what felt quite a bullish public statement from Wagner, which was akin to this group, in his opinion, and he'd worked with them closely enough by that period, too badly affected, too emotionally affected by swings in games in terms of any reference scoring goals as well, but certainly at the moment it's concessions, and he detected that very early on. Well, unfortunately, that was graphically illustrated on Friday night. this group, irrespective of the personnel on the pitch at any given time, don't seem to be able to handle adversity. Now, whether that's, as he alluded to me after the game on Friday, the nature of, they had maybe more tilted towards through necessity last night. A lot of younger players who were inexperienced and were in deep water there against a very, very good attacking Middlesbrough team and didn't know how to handle it. Haven't got almost that muscle memory of a bank of games to fall back on, professional games, which is all well and good. But I think we've seen those kind of negative traits, character traits, when they've had more senior players on the park. So, it leads you to think that it rests on that group of players. Dean Smith couldn't get a tune out of them. David Wagner, seemingly at this stage of his relatively early tenure, cannot get a consistent tune out of this group. So the group clearly has to be shaken up, and that's easy to say, much harder to do in terms of the finances. You mapped it out earlier, Connor. There's contractual arrangements, there's players on decent money who are going to be here contractually well beyond this summer. So if they're not part of your plans, then you have to move them on, and with their tacit acceptance of that, if that is the case, and they're not moving on unless they can get as good, if not better, financial packages elsewhere. That's the law of the jungle. So that's why. I think we can all see, even people who wouldn't purport to have a huge amount of football knowledge from the outside,
us included.
That's what I'm referring to. Yeah, absolutely. But we can all see that it needs quite some fundamental change. But it's one thing seeing that, but also by the same token, I think that's very difficult to enact in one transfer window, maybe even one championship season of football to come. So that's possibly why there is a degree of frustration, dejection, anger maybe in some quarters among the Norwich fan base, that I think they all feel that this is going to be a big turnaround now. And to broaden that out, do they want the same people shaping that who have brought them to this stage? That's a fair question.
But it's also about, and I've said this before as well, whether those people, and let's throw Stuart Webber's name, because I think that's the one that maybe most people reference. But there's others within that as well. It's not fair just to simply say him. There will, you could argue, well, does he now have the political capital to come out and say, yeah, I've overseen this and what is essentially a really, really poor Premier League relegation relative to the money that they've spent, followed by, if they don't get into the playoffs, even if they do and lose, again, I've presided over that. I'm going to be the person to fix it. That's a very difficult message to try and convey for anyone, isn't it?
It is, but conversely, to say nothing, to do nothing, to not message anything to your fan base at the end of this season, that's equally not acceptable, I don't think. And his most recent interview with the Training Ground Guru podcast seemed to infer that he was engaging, him and his football club were engaging with the fan base and were keeping them up to date. I don't see that. So, we've discussed it around this weekend's game, that if this does end up where we think it's going to end up, how do the club respond? How do the top of that football club?
Because they've got to be proactive.
Well, they have. I don't see how they've got any other choice. But what did they do at the end of last Premier League relegation season? It was an internal club arranged interview. And they got criticised heavily for that as well, in terms of accountability, in terms of transparency. They will get the same charges again if they go down the same path, but that's for them to decide in terms of their comms. But ultimately, if I'm a Norwich fan, I don't think it's necessarily Stuart Webber has to go as part of what comes next. But if Stuart Webber is part of what comes next, we need to hear that from him.
And what next is.
And
right?
what it is.
Yeah.
And an acceptance of where they've gone wrong, why they think it's gone wrong, and steps that they want to try and put in place to make it right. It's all about take us out of the equation in the media. In terms of the fan base, it's about taking them on the journey with you. You look around at the best clubs at the moment.
But Norwich did it so well as well.
That's what it's hard to fathom. That from 17 onwards, in very difficult circumstances that he inherited, and nobody disputes that, they almost sold sold a vision to a fan base who were craving something different, and they bought into it.
And this is my point
We're back
about
there
the
again.
plan. You look at where we are now, and they speak, and it's we want to get in the Premier League, we want to stabilise. Well, that's completely different messaging to what
Connor,
it was.
every
3 or 4 years ago.
every
Yeah,
single club in the
I know.
Championship wants to get in the Premier League and stabilise. That's not
that's
a plan.
Why you have to come
that's
out and
not a
speak
plan.
about what you're doing is different, or specifically what you're doing, and
Absolutely.
stick to it.
Well, I think
what we're
part-
hearing is
part of it,
nothing.
right, is the fact that last time it wasn't his fault, right? So he could quite easily come in and criticise everything that had gone before and say it wasn't going right, we needed to change it all.
Yeah.
Whereas now, I think it's difficult for any person to come out and, especially because he's already done it after the last 2 relegations, it's going to be difficult for him to come out now and say, yeah, all right, I got it completely wrong. Because if he comes out and admits, it's all my fault, I've got it wrong 3 times and 3 seasons have gone disastrously because of his decision making, how can he possibly justify his existence in his position? So I think that's where the real difference is. And we can talk about why things aren't the same way communication wise, but for me it's quite clear cut in that he wasn't at the club when all the mistakes were made that he was criticising last time.
Yeah, that's absolutely indisputable. But that shouldn't then be a charter for him remaining in post, moving forward, and not communicating what the next is. What is the next episode look like? What are him and Wagner, if it is Wagner, what are they striving to do in the next phase? As I say, I mean, from my point of view, I certainly wouldn't have any issue if Stuart Webber remained in charge. I've got to be honest, because I think, while he is culpable in a lot of areas, let's not overlook, we're here now talking almost not with a sense of entitlement, because that would be wrong, but the fact that Norwich fans and anybody connected to the club expect them to be a Premier League entity. That wasn't the case when he first walked through the door. It was going the other way, and it was him who engineered it alongside Farker. So, he has a lot of early credit, I think, in terms of somebody who was able to set a tone, set an end point, and actually achieve it as they did so successfully, and feel like they were ahead of the curve and that they were doing things that other clubs weren't doing in a lot of areas, and that was paying off within that self-funded model. But if it was to be him again in terms of the next iteration of this, I personally wouldn't have an issue with that, because if he's still got the hunger and the desire and the drive to do it, he's shown he can do it. But if that was the case, that is the case. But if, just on a final point, if that is the case and that's where his head is at, communicate that to your fan base. And of course you will get Sam's point is valid. There will be plenty who say, you've had your turn, mate, you've had your time, move along now. You're failing, you've failed multiple times now, move on. But he's got that anyway now. Any interview he ever does now, he talks about the criticism and, that he doesn't try and go anywhere near it because he knows it's there now. So that is there. That's not new. That's not going to be amplified if he comes out and does any media or communicates to his fan base at the end of this season. But I just think in terms of trying to turn the page now is absolutely pivotal. Him, people at his level within that football club, in terms of seniority, who are shaping this journey, this destination. What is it? What is the next phase of this Norwich City journey look like? Irrespective of whether he's at the helm or not, what is it? Because it's not enough just to say, well, we want to get back to the Premier League, and then when we get there this time we want to establish ourselves, because every other club in the top part of the Championship certainly, but probably even anywhere League One, I'm sure Ipswich have got that same stated ambition, and other clubs in League One, Plymouth, I'm sure they feel if they can get up this season they can aim for the Premier League, because that's the dream. But it needs to be a bit more nuanced for me than that. It needs to be, right, mistakes have been made, we accept that, but we're going to put this right now, and this is what it's going to look like. At the minute, if there's a void in terms of communication, then how can any Norwich fan, whether you're, as I say, completely done with Webber or you're willing to give him a chance, how can you really row in if you don't know what the next thing looks like?
Yeah, and of course they're not going to speak, and it's quite right that they don't speak until the season's concluded either way, because it can make you look very silly in short. So I think we're all going to have to wait until the season concludes, but you would hope that conversations are beginning to, or certainly have, or are beginning to take place around what that communication looks like, because it's needed. And I'm in a similar boat to you. I wouldn't necessarily have any qualms at all with Stuart Webber being the figurehead of what's next. And he was actually asked, I think we spoke about this at the time, and it was a really good question from Simon, who runs the Training Ground Guru, about, do you feel you're a better kind of disruptor, a better kind of change manager than you are kind of managing the status quo? And I think he kind of agreed with that in his answer. Well, that will essentially be the task. And obviously the next point is about whether, after, and we speak about this with the players, it's the same for the staff. They put so much into 2 promotions. I'm sure a lot of emotional energy went into those Premier League campaigns as well. You're right, the criticism, all of it does take a toll, clearly. On a human level, do you have the energy to commit to that? Because it's going to be a massive summer and a massive project. And I think that's where you almost he and only he holds the answer to that question. Yeah, and it's the same for anyone at the top of that football club. They have to be self-reflective, and they have to ask themselves whether they do, because they're going to have to expend a lot this summer. To move it on then, Sam, I mean, obviously Norwich go to QPR on Wednesday. I've had a look actually on the way back. They've only, after losing games by a 4 goal or more margin, they've only gone on to win. I don't know how many times I could go and count it, but off the top of my head I don't have it. They've only gone on to win the next game twice, both of which came in the Premier League. And you've got to bear in mind, one of those was in November 2013, after they lost 7-0 to Manchester City. They then beat West Ham at home 3-1. And then in January 80, which was Daniel Farker, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. They lost 4-0 at Manchester United and then won 1-0 against Bournemouth. They haven't done it in the Championship. So Brighton, where they lost 5-0, they then went, I think they lost 3 after that. Sheffield Wednesday, I think they drew at Bristol City and at Blackburn. Obviously, Alex Neil was sacked in between those Bristol City and Blackburn games. Obviously, the Sheffield Wednesday won in 2018, a little bit skewered, but they didn't win the opening game of the following season, even though that's not really comparable. So lots of other examples as well, but the history books suggest it's not the type of defeat that or certainly Norwich City aren't able to respond to, particularly at Championship level.
No, and that's quite a massive worry, I think, going into the next 4 games, because on the surface they all look winnable. Maybe West Brom will be tough going there away, but it certainly is one where they'll feel, or they would have felt before this Middlesbrough game, that it was possible to go and get 3 points there. But yeah, without any sort of evidence of bounce back ability in recent years, you wonder where that sort of energy is going to come from. And yesterday I was trying to think of some optimism actually when I saw those 4 games, and I thought,
Adam Eade had some nice pink boots on. That's about as close as I got.
Lovely pink boots, there you go. That was great. I suppose the injuries were some positives, so if you're looking for some of them, have it not the injuries. I worded that poorly. Jonathan Rowe and Sam Byram coming back from injury were positives, but yeah, that inability to come back from big setbacks and make statements after that was worrying. And I was left thinking about Sunderland, and I think they lost, I can't remember who it was to, but they had a big loss before they came to Norwich. Stoke, yeah. And there was sort of a lot of talk about bouncing back and were they going to make a statement, and coming to Carrow Road and being the better team and winning 1-0 probably was that. But I'm not sure Norwich have that characteristic. I'm not sure they've got enough players in that group, especially with those senior pros and those leaders out. I'm not sure they have the characters to really motivate themselves to go and do that. They look like a group with really fragile confidence who probably will suffer from that thrashing now in the coming weeks, and that's terrible news at this stage of the season. I think Paddy said earlier, and it's such a good point, that losing 1 in 7 is bad at any time, but losing 1 in 7 at this crucial stage of not only the season but almost the history of Norwich City and the direction of this football club on a long-term basis, losing 1 in 7 at that point hints to me that the mentality is really poor, and the ability to perform when you need to perform is really poor in this side. And amongst the various issues with this group, I think that's right up there with them, because numerous times we've seen in big games when they've needed to perform, they haven't. And it's easy when you've got a new manager bounce, when they've had David Wagner, they're all keen to impress him and absorb his ideas, and all the fans are behind them and they're loud and they're positive. It's easy to go and beat maybe Preston and Coventry, who are now competing for the playoffs, but they were never in and around the automatic spots. And I think when Norwich went there,
think Coventry had quite a few injury issues, didn't they, on that particular day.
And they were impressed. Them and Preston were just basically bog standard mid-table at that stage. Yeah. So
you're being kind with bog standard.
But I think they can perform when there's not too much pressure on them, but the ability to perform at big stages of the season and in big games really isn't there, and that's a huge worry after this setback going into some of the games where they probably were looking at towards the back end of the season as potentially a big run up to the playoffs, and now that feels very, very far away indeed.
It does, and Paddy, I mean that mentality that we're kind of left to speak about. I remember after the Huddersfield game, David Wagner spoke about these kind of talks that they'd had between him and his staff had with the players, and how they felt that had gone positively, and they've won one game since then. So I mean you can debate it, but that kind of soft underbelly, and it's been a fixture of quite a few Norwich sides in recent years. That probably includes some successful ones as well. This group does seem to suffer from it particularly. I think they've only won one game coming from behind, and that was the Millwall game. It's worrying, isn't it, that this group of players, for all of the quality that we know individually they have, collectively are just unable to respond to, and we spoke about it earlier, that adversity when it's kind of put in front of them.
Well, yes, that is true, but I've just double checked again, and going back to the 1 in 7, I still can't fathom for the life of me why 1 in 7 is the response to the win they had at Millwall, because that was adversity. They were one behind, calamitous goal. Bradshaw obviously scored again today, but profited from Hanley and Gibson and McLean to a lesser extent, not on the same wavelength, at a place where I don't think they'd lost in the league since certainly 22, back end of 22. They'd beaten Sheffield United, they'd drawn with Burnley in recent times. That's about as adverse as you can get for me in the Championship. Millwall traditionally, we know, very hostile place, intimidating place, and they came through, and they were magnificent in terms of how they responded that day. There was quality in their goals. Zara was superb, playing further forward, and also let's not forget how that game shook out when Norwich went 3-2. Sorry, when it went 3-1, Millwall get one back, and the last 10-15 minutes it was barrage of balls flying into the box. That Grant Hanley goal line block deep in stoppage time to preserve the win. It's a mystery to me how that group of players have left that pitch that day when they should have felt invincible, really, and yet we're now looking back at it, and that was the starting point for 1 win in 7. It beggars belief, and it probably does if you want to really stop and think and forensically examine. It cuts to the heart of this group of players and their mentality, like Sam said, and it's not a talent thing, I don't think. It's something innate in this group of players, and that's why, for me, it needs a huge shake-up, and it needs personnel to be shifted out and new personnel to be brought in. But again, at the risk of repeating what we've said already, that's what it needs, but can that be delivered in one transfer window? Unlikely. So that's why you fear this is going to take a bit of a longer turnaround to it, and it might not be next season. It might be the season after. It might be the season after that. It might never be the next season. If you look at some of the clubs we've discussed already in this pod who have languished in the Championship, or worse in certain cases. Norwich themselves have fallen below the Championship, we know, in modern times. So, that for me, I think when the dust settles and we're just examining the Wagner element of this season, that Millwall watershed will be the biggest mystery as to why they didn't go the other way, and why we're not now, instead of 1 win in 7, it's 1 defeat in the next 7. Because that, I think, for most of us, having seen what they produced at Millwall that day, if you'd have asked us in the next 7 games which of those two scenarios was more likely, I think we'd have all plumped for the 6 wins or 6 unbeaten games out of 7, because there was nothing really then holding this group back from going on, fulfilling their potential, securing that top 6 spot, and then really hitting those playoffs with that momentum that they would have garnered from a run to the season in that fashion. Because now it's gone, and it's recriminations when it should have been reflections on what a magnificent achievement from Wagner to as Alex Neil did previously, albeit from a slightly earlier starting point, to galvanise a group who looked to be going the wrong way pick them up, dust them down, a few home truths, knock a few heads together, and they went on an unforgettable journey that ended pertinently, given what we're discussing Friday night, beating Middlesbrough in the playoffs on a never-to-be-forgotten occasion at Wembley. But, maybe it's quite relevant. You look at that squad, we're talking about that 14-15 squad, the Bradley Johnsons of this world, Bassong when he was committed and focused, John Ruddy, really streetwise operator, fully experienced player. Russell Martin, I know he had his detractors, but he'd been round the block. They had that in them.
Houlihan, Jerome.
Yeah, they had the quality. They had the quality. They had the talent, but they had the temperament. When it got tight, when it got difficult, they found a way down that stretch, culminating, of course, in getting the better of it, switching those 2 playoff games, and then dismissively, that playoff game was done. We can all remember it. That was done in the first quarter because they were so much better than Middlesbrough in any department. You want a talent game or you want a game of football, we'll beat you at that. Remember that superb team goal that Nathan Redmond finished. You want to roll your sleeves up and have a battle, that Bradley Johnson inspired team would have done that as well. This group, no chance, as was proven yesterday. When it came on top, to use that phraseology, in the second part of that first half, they wilted. In fact, they threw it in. It was a surrender. It was a capitulation. And they're strong terms to bandy about, but on the evidence of what we've seen since Millwall, what else can you conclude about this group of players? When it comes on top, they throw it in.
They've lost it, haven't they? It's as simple as that. The other teams, if they not to become Todd Campbell, but if they'd have gone on after Millwall and done what they should have done, they would have finished in the top 6. They have thrown it away themselves. That's the point that I'm making. They have beaten themselves in that regard. One thing I did want to talk about before the end of the pod, and I suppose we have to really, is Aaron Ramsey, which just a really bizarre set of events for me, really. He scores a goal, which was probably inevitable, really, probably in every script that was ever going to be written in that game. Fair play to him, he was 2 yards out and he didn't put it over the bar like he did at Hull earlier on in the season. But then he proceeds to go and celebrate in front of the Norwich fans in a really provocative way, really bizarre way for somebody who got a championship opportunity. Yes, of course, there was the Dean Smith connection, but after what was a pretty substandard loan at Cheltenham in League One, he didn't set the world alight by any means. Yet Norwich gave him an opportunity. There was a moment of where he scored. I can't remember what the goal was, but he was kind of thumping and kissing the badge. It was very much, or very supported in terms of from the fan base. Whether he feels grievances because his loan was terminated or something's gone on, I don't know, but it was just a very bizarre situation to have him as visually provocative as he was towards a group of fans who by and large supported him. And look, whether he feels that there was criticism about his exit, I don't necessarily think it was at him. I think it was more the situation. But then almost the laughable bit for me is he obviously goes off with an injury, which you don't wish on any player at all, irrespective of what they've done. But then he has an opportunity, and maybe it was quite telling actually. He comes off the pitch, and he comes off the pitch in kind of Norwich's half, so in the half that they're attacking, which was closer to where the Norwich fans were. And instead of walking what would have been the shorter route, considering he was injured, which would have taken him in front of the Norwich fans, he opted to go for the longer route. Just a really bizarre episode from someone who, I don't know, as I said, Sam, I always felt was pretty well supported at Norwich City in his very brief spell here. He will have his reasons, and without hearing his side of the story, we don't know exactly what's happened. But I just found the whole episode pretty unsavoury, really. Yeah,
I thought it left a bit of a sour taste, and unless there's something that we don't really know about, which is certainly very possible, it's quite hard to fathom why. I've seen some maybe theorise that Dean Smith's exit and his treatment by the fans has something to do with it, given Ramsey's relationship with Smith and the fact that Smith gave him an opportunity to train with the senior team at Aston Villa, and then obviously brought him to Norwich, where he gave him a lot of game time at Championship level. But yeah,
he was part of a team that underperformed under Dean Smith. So
yeah, I didn't really understand it at all, and I felt it was probably the last thing that group of fans, with the traffic they'd been through and the amount of travelling they had done after 8 minutes, to have to cope with that was quite rough on them. And I'm pleased for him that for whatever reason he feels he's proved doubters wrong, but I'm not sure I saw many of them when he was at Norwich. I don't know if it's one of those things where he's seen one comment, and I think a lot of people are susceptible to something like this, where maybe they'll see one comment and it really sticks in their head, and despite
it becomes everyone's comment.
Exactly,
yeah.
and despite the amount of positive criticism, I think it's partly human nature to siphon off the good bits and focus on what people have said. So I don't know if that's in his character, and maybe he's seen one or two things that he felt were over the line, and he's generalised it, as you said, and made them everyone's comments. But yeah, I didn't really expect that at all, and I'm not sure Norwich's players did, which maybe hints at more confusion, because if they had known that it had been some sort of dramatic fallout with someone, and they knew the reasons why Ramsey was so angry, I'm not sure they would be so irritated and bewildered by his behaviour, because after that goal we saw Josh Sargent seem to be quite angry with Ramsey and trying to have a word with him. Ono Hernandez came over from left wing almost over to the right back position to express his frustrations when Ramsey was on the floor injured in the first half, and Norwich were trying to get the game back underway. So yeah, there seemed to be a lot of irritation from a number of players sort of throughout the match with Ramsey, and I think that probably gives you an insight into quite how confused everyone involved in the situation is. But Aaron Ramsey is the man with the answer to that question, so I wouldn't mind if he did some media in the next few days, but barring that probably slim possibility, it's difficult to see whether we'll ever get an explanation, and it might just be one of those football folklore stories that stays behind the curtain for a good long while. But yeah, I felt for Norwich's fans there, because I didn't think they really deserved that for how much they put into supporting the team on that day, and also what they'd given Aaron Ramsey during his time at Norwich. It did feel slightly harsh and slightly needless for me, to be honest.
Does he get a Middlesbrough loan without that spell at Norwich City? I don't think he does. So there we go. And those conversations that you mentioned there definitely continued post-match, because as we were waiting, myself and Chris Gorham, to speak to Angus Gunn after the game, him and Max Aarons had to be separated in the tunnel, and it was long after the full-time whistle, because Ramsey, I'm paraphrasing and leaving a lot of words out, but essentially felt he'd left a little bit on that tackle, and claimed he was trying to have a constructive conversation, which I don't necessarily think he was. But both of those players got kind of bundled in their respective changing rooms, and Johnny Howson was left asking kind of what had happened. So there we go. Paddy, I mean, how would you end this podcast? Really, it's been a tough one, maybe slightly cathartic for people. I don't know if it's been slightly cathartic for us, but it's a tricky old spot that they're in at the moment. But for all that we've spoken about, and obviously results are not massively going their way as some of these games hit half time. So Coventry are winning. That one doesn't quite look like it's half time yet. Luton are beating Rotherham, which is standard. Millwall beating Preston, which I would say is probably the worst result for Norwich, really. Sunderland have got an equaliser against Birmingham. They were 1-0 down. Or obviously you may well listen to this and know the full-time scores, and Watford are beating Bristol City as well, and West Brom are losing to Stoke. So at this moment in time, as we sit here around this table, Norwich City sit in 9th on the table, obviously with Blackburn to play later, but there'll be 4 points behind Millwall, 1 point still off the playoffs, and Coventry are in there at the moment. There's a gang of teams at this moment around kind of 59 to 62. So for as much as we kind of talk about Norwich and on all of those aspects, for David Wagner, it's about kind of resetting, and if this picture does stay the same, it's about trying to get this team up for a push in the last 4 games, isn't it? But when you've not scored a home goal since Marquinhos' won against Cardiff in February, and you've won 1 in 7, and the mood around the place is tough, and you've just lost 5-1, that feels like a really tall order.
It does, but I mean we're nearly at half time in these games, and Norwich remain what they were at the final whistle Friday night, which is a point out of the top 6. Yes, Blackburn have games in hand. Yes, they've dropped down a place in terms of the league positions, but it's not beyond the realms that they'll come the final whistle in these games this afternoon, Saturday afternoon, they'll still be a point out. So if you're the arch optimist, you go in and you tell that group of players, well, we're the same. We haven't lost any materially, haven't lost any ground in terms of the situation. If they can amass enough points in what games remain, then at least they prolong it to the final game and Blackpool at home. But I think increasingly for me, we're in a holding pattern now, and it's all about signals for the what next, and that's in small areas. It's a Byram coming back in, who you think might be part of it moving forward. Certainly Johnny Rowe, Abu Kamara, seeing more of those. Conversely, seeing less of Timu Pukki. We know he's not going to be here beyond the summer. He's not offering anything at all really at the moment, and he's one part of a broader issue about unlocking some goal scoring threat, but he isn't, we know, definitively not going to be part of this. So I think we start to see less of him in the starting 11s, at least down the stretch, and that's where I feel this is at now. It's, yes, not mathematically impossible, so they will press on regardless, but for all the reasons discussed in the previous 55 plus minutes here, it's about what next, and little signals of where Wagner's thinking is, because along with Webber, until we're told different, those are the two who are going to shape the what next. So we'll continue to tread water, to use that metaphor, and then once we know where we're at, then maybe we can put our feet on the bottom. I don't know why I'm going down a swimming analogy, but we can put our feet on the bottom of the pool. I'll go with it now.
Keep going now. Make sure we don't drown.
We'll take a pause, and
can you take a pause when you're swimming?
Well, if you've got your feet on the bottom, I'm talking like you're in the shallow end at that point.
Right, okay.
So you can rest.
But are they in the shallow end?
Well, in the sense of the season will be over. We could do another hour on this. It's gone very philosophical, but and then it'll be about hopefully navigating a path to the other end of the pool, where the promotion is, where the deep end, exactly where you want to be, because that means. Do
you want to be at the deep end?
You do, because the deep end is where it's at. Who wants to be down the shallow end? Nobody wants to be in the shallow end. Well, if you can't swim, then
get out of the pool.
There's not going to be a lot of chance of you. No, we'll stop right here now. Yeah, I'm trying to butcher swimming analogies with football, but it's not really working. So, but ultimately, I think I've said ultimately about 8 times in this podcast.
Someone's going to pull you up on that.
Well, I've said it, and I've pulled myself up, haven't I? Now, so I've replaced fundamentally, but I've brought in ultimately off the bench. But it just feels like we know what's got to happen, or we know what league they're going to be in next season, but we can't definitively say that, and certainly they can't say that internally. And until they can, then we'll have to go along with the charade that they still are in the playoff mix and that they can somehow scramble into the top 6. When I think, graphically illustrated at the Riverside on Friday night, they're nowhere near the teams who justifiably can expect to look that they can go into those playoffs and really challenge for that third and final promotion spot in the Premier League next season. So as I say, we'll tread water for a few more games, and then when the inevitable is confirmed, we really need then to see some serious messaging about what comes next, because if we don't, then I fear it's going to be quite a fractious summer, because I don't think there's too many Norwich fans, despite again the healthy take-up of the season ticket numbers, but we've said that before, don't conflate season ticket renewals with tacit acceptance for the direction of travel. That's clearly not the case. And it was visibly illustrated at the end of Dean Smith's tenure in that toxic Blackburn game in December at Carrow Road. They won't accept this again next season, I'm pretty sure of that. So if it is the Championship, then let's see who's on board, who's driving it forward, and what direction they want to drive it in, and then it's up to them to execute the plan. At the minute, I don't think we really know the answers to a lot of those questions, and that needs to happen. Clarity is the bare minimum what your Norwich fans are going to need from here on in, I think.
Yeah, Norwich front calling their way to the end of the Championship season, and we've done a running bomb to the end of the podcast. So we'll leave it there. The tea's drunk, the fat has been chewed. and I'm not quite sure if we got anywhere or answered any kind of questions, but hopefully you enjoyed listening. Thank you very much as always for joining us. Of course, PinkUn.com and the PinkUn Plus app, the place to go throughout the week for all of the latest content. Will of course be at Loftus Road, dear me, for on Wednesday for the next instalment of this incredibly fun Norwich City season. Hope to see a lot of you there, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you very much for listening.